In the heart of the countryside, where time seemed to move a little slower and the wind carried whispers of old tales, there stood a house that had seen better days. The house was small, tucked away in a field that had long been left to nature's devices. Wildflowers and tall grass swayed lazily in the breeze, almost as if they were keeping the house company. To the few villagers who lived nearby, the house was an old friend, one they seldom visited but often spoke about in quiet tones. Inside, the house was a reflection of its owner, Chris. The furniture was sturdy, if worn, and everything had a place, just as it had for decades. There were few modern conveniences, save for a small television set that crackled with static more often than it played anything coherent. The walls were adorned with pictures that told stories of a life lived fully, if not always easily. The frames were dusty, but the memories they held were clear, at least to Chris. Chris stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in his bathroom, splashing cold water onto his face. The sting of the water against his freshly shaved skin was a sharp reminder of the burns that had marred his face so many years ago. He kept the bathroom dimly lit, the shadows softening the harshness of the scars that traced across his cheeks and jaw. For Chris, the scars were not just a reminder of pain. They were a reason to stay hidden, to keep himself tucked away in the house that had become his refuge. Today, however, was different. Today, he needed to leave. With a deep breath, Chris patted his face dry with a towel that had seen too many washes. He stared at his reflection, his blue eyes steady, though they held a heaviness that spoke of weariness. It had been months since he had last ventured out of his little estate. The thought of stepping outside filled him with a familiar dread, but necessity was a powerful motivator. "Just get it over with, old man," he muttered to himself, his voice gravelly from years of disuse. He moved slowly, each step deliberate as he gathered what he needed for the trip. His wallet, his keys, useless for now, but a comfort to carry, and the small notebook where he had meticulously written down the bus schedule. Chris hadn't taken a bus in years, but today he had no choice. His driver's license had expired, and without it, he couldn't visit his sister, the only family he had left. As he locked the door behind him, the familiar creak of the hinges echoed in the still air. Chris paused on the porch, taking in the quiet of the morning. The walk to the bus stop was short, but it felt like a mile to Chris. His worn boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence that surrounded him. He kept his head down, avoiding the gaze of the few villagers who passed by on their way to the market or the fields. They didn't say much to him, and for that, Chris was grateful. He knew they whispered about him, about the man with the scarred face who kept to himself. The bus stop was a simple wooden bench under the shade of an old oak tree. Chris sat down with a heavy sigh, resting his cane beside him. The bus wouldn't arrive for another 10 minutes, but he was content to wait. He pulled his hat down a little lower, hoping to shield himself from any curious eyes. It wasn't that he expected anyone to recognize him. Most of the villagers had long since accepted him as part of the landscape, something to be acknowledged but not examined too closely. As he waited, Chris's thoughts drifted to his sister. She lived in a town not too far away, but far enough that driving was necessary. It had been months since he'd last seen her, and he could still hear the concern in her voice during their last phone call. The distant rumble of the bus approaching pulled Chris from his thoughts. He stood up, his joints protesting the movement, and straightened his coat. As the bus came to a stop in front of him, Chris took a deep breath and stepped forward. The driver, a young man with a friendly smile, didn't bat an eye at Chris's appearance. He simply nodded and waited for Chris to board. "Morning," the driver said, his tone cheerful. "Morning," Chris replied, his voice barely above a whisper. The bus ride to town was uneventful, the countryside rolling by in a blur of green and gold. Chris kept his gaze fixed out the window, watching the familiar landscape slip away. The hum of the bus engine and the rhythmic bump of the road beneath the tires created a soothing monotony, allowing his mind to wander. The other passengers were quiet, absorbed in their own thoughts or conversations spoken in hushed tones. Chris could feel their eyes on him, though none dared to stare outright. He was used to it, those fleeting glances, the quick looks of curiosity or pity. It had been this way for as long as he could remember. The burn scars on his face, twisted and angry, were a magnet for attention, whether he wanted it or not. A small voice broke through the quiet, clear and innocent. "Mommy, why does that man's face look like that?" Chris's heart tightened for a moment, but he didn't move. He could see the reflection of the mother and child in the window, the little girl's wide eyes filled with curiosity. The mother's expression tightened as she quickly bent down to hush her daughter, her voice a rushed whisper. "Shh, darling, don't say that. It's not polite." Chris could feel the tension from across the bus. The mother was embarrassed, her cheeks flushed as she cast a nervous glance in his direction. Chris knew what she was thinking, that her child's innocent question had somehow offended him, that she needed to make it right. But Chris wasn't offended. How could he be? The little girl didn't know any better. She wasn't old enough to understand the weight of her words, the years of pain and isolation they stirred up. He turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the girl's eye. With a gentle smile, he tried to convey something he wasn't sure he could put into words. Understanding, perhaps, or maybe reassurance. The girl blinked at him, her curiosity undimmed but tempered now by a child's instinct to follow her mother's lead. The mother smiled back awkwardly, though her eyes were still clouded with worry. She pulled her daughter close, whispering something Chris couldn't make out. The girl nodded, but her gaze lingered on him, as if she wanted to ask more but didn't dare. Chris looked away, back out the window. He knew his smile wouldn't ease the woman's worry, nor would it erase the discomfort that had settled over the bus like a heavy blanket. But it was all he could offer, a small gesture in a world that often didn't know how to handle the sight of him. He had lived with such reactions for almost his entire life. People didn't mean to be unkind, but their unease was like a shadow that followed him everywhere. The DMV office was a picture of frustration. The hallway was packed with people, all of them visibly annoyed by the long wait. The air conditioner, barely functioning, did little to combat the oppressive heat that had settled over the room. People fanned themselves with anything they could find, hats, folders, even their own hands, trying to create some semblance of relief from the stagnant air. In one corner, a young security guard leaned against the wall, surveying the crowd with a look of boredom etched on his face. He had been there for hours, watching as the same faces grew more tired and more irritated. Seniors slumped in their seats, their patience worn thin. Migrant workers in dirty clothes shifted uncomfortably, their hands calloused from long hours of labor. Nervous young mothers tried to quiet their crying children, their eyes darting anxiously to the clock. It was a typical day at the DMV, where time seemed to stretch endlessly. But today, something, or rather, someone, caught the security guard's attention. Chris stood at the back of the hallway, his faded blue jacket hanging loosely on his tall frame. The jacket was old, the kind that might have once been worn by a soldier, though it was clear that Chris was far from the image of a polished Navy man. His appearance was disheveled, his hair unruly, and the burn scars on his face only added to the unsettling impression he left on those who dared to look too closely. He was a stark contrast to the others in the room, not just because of his size, but because of the air of discomfort that seemed to cling to him. He towered over the crowd, his anxious glances at his watch betraying his worry. The DMV was closing for lunch soon, and he had yet to be seen. Each minute that ticked by felt like a lost opportunity, and the thought of having to return another day filled him with dread. The security guard, sensing an opportunity to break the monotony of his day, let a grin spread across his face as he approached Chris. There was something almost playful in the way he spoke, though his words carried an edge. Looks like you won't make it to your appointment today, old man," the guard said, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a few others in the hallway. "Lucy and Denise won't be sticking around any longer." Chris looked down at the guard, his eyes narrowing slightly. The comment wasn't lost on him. The guard was enjoying this, playing on the fear that Chris might have to turn back and come another day. He didn't respond immediately, weighing his options. Part of him wanted to snap back, to tell the guard to mind his own business, but another part of him, the part that had learned to navigate these situations with a quiet dignity, held his tongue. Instead, Chris forced a small, tight smile. "I'll take my chances," he replied, his voice steady despite the unease churning in his stomach. The guard's grin widened, but he didn't push further. He had gotten what he wanted, a small reaction, a break in the monotony of his day. He nodded, almost as if he was granting Chris some kind of twisted permission to continue waiting, and then moved back to his post. Chris exhaled slowly, his hand tightening around the cane he carried. The hallway felt even more claustrophobic now, the walls closing in as the seconds ticked by. But he wasn't going to leave, not after coming all this way. He had survived worse than this. A little heat and a rude security guard weren't going to stop him. Chris finally reached the front of the line just as the clock on the wall ticked toward lunchtime. His relief was short-lived, however, as he caught sight of the two women behind the counter. Lucy and Denise, both middle-aged with a practiced air of indifference, sat side by side at their desks. They were fixtures at the DMV, known to the locals as much for their short tempers as for their ability to turn a simple task into an ordeal. Lucy was the first to look up, her heavily mascaraed eyes narrowing as they landed on Chris. Her lips, painted in a shade of coral that clashed with her stern expression, twisted slightly in what might have been an attempt at a smile, or a grimace, it was hard to tell. Beside her, Denise barely glanced up from her computer screen, her fingers tapping away at the keys with the kind of lethargy that spoke of someone who had long since grown bored of her job. Chris approached the counter, his cane tapping lightly against the floor. The noise seemed to annoy Lucy, who let out a barely concealed sigh. She leaned back in her chair, folding her arms across her chest as she waited for him to speak. "I'm here to renew my driver's license," Chris said, his voice polite but firm. Lucy raised an eyebrow, her eyes drifting to the clock on the wall. "You're cutting it close, aren't you?" she remarked, her tone dripping with condescension. "We're about to close for lunch." Chris nodded, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I've been waiting a while," he replied evenly. "I'd appreciate it if we could get this done before you close." Denise finally looked up, her gaze sweeping over Chris with an expression that was almost dismissive. "Did you bring the necessary paperwork?" she asked, her voice flat and uninterested. Chris reached into his jacket and pulled out a neatly folded stack of papers, sliding them across the counter toward her. Denise barely glanced at them before picking them up with exaggerated slowness. She began to leaf through the pages, her expression growing more sour with each passing second. "You know," Denise began, her voice taking on a patronizing tone, "if people would just come prepared, it would make our jobs a lot easier." Lucy smirked, clearly enjoying the little show. "Most folks don't realize how much work goes into this," she added, leaning forward slightly as if she were about to share a secret. "We have to deal with so many people every day. It's a wonder we can get anything done at all." Chris tightened his grip on the cane, but he kept his voice calm. "I've brought everything that was required. If there's a problem, I'd appreciate it if you could tell me what it is so I can fix it." Denise let out a small, derisive laugh. "Oh, there's no problem, not with the paperwork. It's just, well, you know how it is. We like to help the people who help us, if you know what I mean." Lucy nodded, her smile widening. "A little courtesy goes a long way," she said, her voice sweet with mock sincerity. "It's amazing how much faster things can go when someone's willing to be nice. And maybe say a nice word or two about the people who are helping them." The implication was clear, and Chris felt a cold anger begin to rise within him. He had encountered people like Lucy and Denise before, people who used their small amount of power to make others jump through hoops, who took pleasure in making things difficult just because they could. He had learned long ago that reacting with anger or frustration only made things worse. Taking a deep breath, Chris forced himself to smile, a small, controlled expression that didn't reach his eyes. "I appreciate the work you both do," he said, his tone measured. "It must be difficult dealing with so many people every day." Lucy and Denise exchanged a glance, their smug expressions faltering slightly. It wasn't the kind of flattery they had been fishing for, but it was close enough. Denise returned to her computer screen, tapping a few keys with exaggerated slowness. "All right," she said at last, her voice tinged with reluctant acceptance. "I'll see what I can do. But next time, try to get here earlier. We don't have all day to wait on people." Lucy leaned back in her chair, clearly bored now that the moment of petty power was over. Yeah, next time, don't cut it so close. We have lives too, you know. Chris turned back, his expression a mix of frustration and disbelief. I didn't choose to cut it so close, he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. There were people ahead of me in line, and I waited just like everyone else. His words seemed to strike a nerve. Lucy and Denise exchanged a look, their eyes narrowing as if they'd been personally insulted. Without a word, they both stood up from their desks, their movements slow and deliberate, like queens vacating their thrones. There were still 15 minutes left before the official lunch break, but Lucy and Denise didn't care. They gathered their expensive handbags with the kind of poise that suggested they were above such petty concerns as customer service. Their faces were masks of indifference, not a single emotion betraying the satisfaction they clearly took in exerting their authority. Chris was taken aback. Ladies, please don't leave, he said, his voice catching in his throat. I didn't mean to say anything bad. I was just pointing out that I waited for my turn, just like everyone else. Please, I've been here since this morning. But Lucy and Denise ignored him completely, not even sparing him a glance as they headed for the door. Chris felt a wave of desperation wash over him. He couldn't let this happen, not after waiting so long. Please, he called after them, his voice more urgent now. I came all the way from my village. My bus leaves in 20 minutes and it's the last one for today. I'm begging you. Lucy stopped just as she reached the door, turning slightly to give him a look of irritation. Listen, old man, there are plenty of people here just like you. There are only 3 of us, and we're entitled to our lunch break. Come back afterward. Before Chris could respond, Denise's face twisted in disgust. Guard! She shouted, her voice echoing through the stuffy hallway. Get this bum out of here immediately! The security guard, who had been dozing off in his corner, snapped awake at the sound of Denise's command. He moved quickly, more out of fear of losing his job than any real desire to help. His mind flashed to his wife's stern face, her warnings about what would happen if he messed up at work. He couldn't afford to disappoint her. Without thinking twice, the guard marched over to Chris, grabbing him by the arm with more force than was necessary. Come on, let's go, he muttered, pushing Chris toward the door. Wait, please. Chris tried to resist, his voice laced with panic, but the guard was already shoving him out the door. The last thing Chris saw as he was forced out was Lucy and Denise walking away, their backs straight, their heads held high, as if they had done nothing wrong. The door slammed shut behind him, and Chris heard the sharp click of the lock. He stood there for a moment, stunned, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of anger, humiliation, and despair swirling inside him. He had been so close, only to be turned away because of a few careless words. There was a new employee who had joined the office recently. Unlike her colleagues, the young clerk Jennifer stood out for being different. Jennifer was a young woman with a quiet demeanor that often led her colleagues to overlook her. She was diligent, focused, and always ready to help, qualities that Lucy and Denise found convenient, if not exactly admirable. To them, Jennifer was the quiet, mousy girl, a nickname they used freely behind her back. Her modesty and work ethic were viewed not as strengths, but as signs of weakness, making her an easy target for their derision. Lucy and Denise had been more than pleased to have Jennifer join the department. Her presence allowed them to shirk their duties without consequence, while Jennifer handled the bulk of the work, sorting through paperwork, assisting customers, and making sure the office ran smoothly. Lucy and Denise occupied their time with more leisurely pursuits. Magazines were their go-to distraction, and their lunch breaks often stretched far beyond the allotted hour as they indulged in shopping trips or long, lazy meals at the local diner. They never hesitated to return late, knowing Jennifer would cover for them. After all, who would complain? Certainly not Jennifer, who never seemed to raise her voice or show any sign of dissatisfaction. Her quietness was, to Lucy and Denise, a sign that she was content to be the office drudge, the one who did the work while they reaped the benefits. But the truth was that Jennifer wasn't oblivious to their behavior. She noticed the way they slipped out early and returned late, how they would leave stacks of unfinished tasks on her desk without so much as a word of thanks. She was aware of the whispered comments and the way they looked at her when they thought she wasn't paying attention. She knew they called her Bird, a mocking nickname that referenced her single status and her quiet nature. They didn't want to acknowledge that Jennifer, with her tasteful, modest clothing and minimal makeup on a fresh face, was naturally beautiful in a way that neither of them could match. Instead, they chose to focus on her perceived shortcomings, gossiping about her behind her back, and spreading rumors that had no basis in reality. Now, Jennifer's appearance was another source of their spite. She dressed simply, in clothes that were neat and appropriate, yet always managed to carry an air of understated elegance. Jennifer was in the back room, meticulously filing away a stack of papers when she heard the commotion. Without a second thought, she dropped the papers and hurried out of the room. As she stepped into the hallway, she saw the security guard roughly pushing an older man out of the office. The sight made her stomach turn. The man's face was etched with a mixture of desperation and exhaustion, and the scene felt all too familiar. A cruel reminder of how people like Lucy and Denise treated those who couldn't defend themselves. Jennifer rushed to the door, her shoes tapping urgently against the linoleum floor. She was about to push it open when Lucy's voice stopped her cold. "If you help every customer like that," Lucy said, a sneer curling her lips, "you'll never have enough time to finish all the work. One person helping everyone else will just slow things down." Jennifer paused, the weight of Lucy's words pressing down on her, but then she looked through the glass door and saw the man, slumped and defeated, walking away slowly, his steps heavy with despair. She couldn't just let him go like that, not after everything he'd been through. Ignoring Lucy's taunt, Jennifer pushed the door open and called out, "Sir, please wait." The man stopped in his tracks and turned toward her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope that he seemed afraid to trust. As he turned fully, Jennifer saw the burn scars that marred one side of his face, their angry red lines a testament to some long-ago tragedy. For a moment she hesitated, the shock of his appearance catching her off guard, but she quickly composed herself and stepped forward. "Please come back to the office," Jennifer said gently. "I'll take care of everything, and you'll make it in time for your bus." The man's shoulders sagged with relief as he nodded, too exhausted to argue. Jennifer led him back into the office, her heart pounding with a mix of anger at her colleagues and determination to make things right. As she worked on the man's paperwork, the atmosphere in the office felt heavy, as if the air itself was thick with the unspoken tension. Chris sat hunched over in a chair, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he stared blankly at a spot on the floor. He didn't say much, and Jennifer didn't push him to speak. She could feel the weight of his experience in the silence between them. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Jennifer finished processing the paperwork. She carefully handed the completed document to the man, who was still visibly shaken by the events of the day. "Here you go," she said softly, placing the paper in his hands. "And I'm sorry for what my colleagues said. Their work is stressful, and sometimes they let it get the best of them. Unfortunately, this is what happens to people in this office sometimes." The man looked at her, his eyes softening as he took the document. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been very kind. I wish you happiness." Jennifer watched as he left the office, her heart heavy yet filled with a small sense of satisfaction. She had done what she could, even if it was just a small act of kindness in a world that often seemed devoid of it. An hour later, Lucy and Denise returned from their extended lunch break, laughing and chatting as if they hadn't a care in the world. But as soon as they entered the office, they were met with a wall of angry glares from the people still waiting in line. The atmosphere had changed in their absence, the tension in the room now palpable. "Insolent," someone in the crowd muttered under their breath, loud enough for others to hear. "The girl is working alone while they just walk around." Another person chimed in, their voice rising above the murmurs. "No, we can't let this go, we should file a complaint." But someone else sighed, a note of resignation in their tone. "What good will it do? They'll just get fired and replaced by others. It's better to just bribe them and let them choke on it." The murmurs of discontent grew louder, the anger of the people simmering just below the surface. Lucy and Denise exchanged uneasy glances but quickly brushed off the hostility with practiced indifference. They knew the system, knew that complaints rarely went anywhere. Besides, they had been in this job too long to worry about a few disgruntled customers. The day continued as usual, but the atmosphere remained tense. By the time the office was closing, Lucy and Denise were back to their usual routines, gossiping and mocking Jennifer as they tidied up their desks. "We've never seen such a fool," Denise snickered, her voice dripping with malice. "That man lied to you and got help out of pity, and you got tricked." Lucy laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the quiet office. "You really are too soft, Jennifer. One of these days you'll learn that people like him don't deserve your sympathy." But Jennifer didn't respond. She had learned long ago that arguing with them was pointless. Instead, she quietly finished her work and gathered her things. She was tired, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that she had done the right thing. Despite Jennifer's best efforts, Chris missed his bus. He had barely stepped out of the DMV when he saw it pulling away from the stop, the engine rumbling as it disappeared down the road. He stood there for a moment, his shoulders slumping in defeat. The day had already been difficult, and this felt like the final blow. But there was nothing he could do now. There wouldn't be another bus until the next day. Chris sighed heavily and made a decision. If the bus wouldn't take him home, then he would walk. It wasn't an easy journey. His home was miles away, and his legs weren't as strong as they used to be. But he wasn't about to let this day break him. He had survived worse. He could survive this too. The sun was beginning its descent as Chris left the town behind. The sound of his cane tapping against the pavement was the only noise in the still evening air. Chris walked slowly, each step deliberate, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The town's outskirts soon gave way to open fields, the landscape familiar yet distant, as if he was seeing it through a fog. He had been walking for nearly an hour, his legs aching from the effort, when he heard the low rumble of an engine approaching from behind. Chris paid it little mind at first, expecting the vehicle to pass him by like the few others had. But instead, the sound grew closer and then slowed. Chris turned to see a pickup truck pulling up alongside him, the tires crunching on the gravel shoulder of the road. The truck came to a stop a few feet ahead of him. Chris watched warily as the driver's door opened, and a man in sunglasses stepped out. The man was tall, with broad shoulders and an air of confidence that was hard to ignore. But what struck Chris the most was the way the man just stood there, staring at him, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Chris came to a halt, gripping his cane tightly as he looked up at the man, a question in his eyes. The man said nothing at first, simply staring at Chris in stunned silence. Then slowly, he reached up and removed his sunglasses. "Chris?" The man finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Is it really you?" Chris frowned, studying the man's face more closely. There was something familiar about him, a memory tugging at the edges of his mind. But before Chris could respond, the man stepped forward, his expression one of awe. "It's me, Ryan Lewis. We served together, remember? Navy SEALs back in the day. I can't believe it's you." Chris blinked, the recognition dawning on him like a slow sunrise. Ryan had been a younger man when they had last seen each other, full of energy and promise. But the years had changed them both. Ryan's hair was speckled with grey now, and there were lines on his face that spoke of time and experience. But the fire in his eyes was the same. "Ryan," Chris murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I remember you. It's been a long time." Ryan nodded, a wide smile breaking across his face. "Too long," he agreed. Then his expression grew more serious. "What are you doing out here on foot? Why didn't you drive?" Chris sighed, the weight of the day suddenly pressing down on him again. "It's a long story," he said, his voice heavy with weariness. "I went to the DMV to renew my license, but things didn't go well. I missed my bus, so I figured I'd just walk home." Ryan's face darkened with concern. "They gave you trouble at the DMV?" he asked, his tone sharp. Chris nodded, too tired to go into detail. "But Ryan, wasn't one to let things slide. "That's unacceptable," he said, his voice low and angry. "What happened?" As they talked, Ryan guided Chris to the truck and helped him into the passenger seat. Chris didn't protest. His legs were grateful for the rest. Ryan climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, but instead of heading straight for Chris's home, he turned in the opposite direction. "I was just about to take my son fishing," Ryan explained as they drove. "He's been looking forward to it all week. But first, I'm going to make a call to some people at the DMV headquarters. I work there now, and I'll make sure those people who treated you poorly are held accountable." Chris didn't know what to say. The kindness, the recognition, and the determination in Ryan's voice were overwhelming. He had grown so used to being overlooked, treated as if he were invisible, that this sudden attention felt almost surreal. As they drove, Ryan continued to talk about the old days, sharing stories and memories that brought a faint smile to Chris's lips. They arrived at a serene lake just as the sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the water. Ryan's son was already there, setting up their fishing gear with an enthusiasm that reminded Chris of his own youth. "Dad!" the boy called out as they approached. "Who's that with you?" "This is Chris," Ryan said, putting a hand on Chris's shoulder. "He's a hero, son. He served with me in the Navy. We're lucky to have him with us today." Chris's eyes widened at Ryan's words. He hadn't thought of himself as a hero in a long time, if ever. The world had moved on, and he had always felt like a relic of a past that no one cared about anymore. They spent the evening by the lake, the air filled with the sound of laughter and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Ryan and his son treated Chris like he was one of the family, including him in their conversations, asking him for advice on fishing techniques and listening intently as he shared his knowledge. For the first time in years, Chris felt like he belonged somewhere. As the sky darkened and the first stars began to twinkle above, they packed up their gear and headed back to the truck. Ryan's son fell asleep in the back seat, exhausted from the day's excitement. Chris sat quietly in the passenger seat, his heart full of emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Ryan pulled the truck to a stop in front of Chris's house. Before Chris could say anything, Ryan turned to him, his expression serious. "Chris, I meant what I said earlier. You're a hero. You deserve better than what you've been through, and I promise you, things are going to change." Chris nodded, his throat tight with emotion. He had heard those words before, but this time they felt different. This time, they came from someone who truly understood what it meant to serve, to sacrifice. "Thank you," Chris whispered, his voice breaking. "Thank you, Ryan. You don't know what this means to me." Ryan smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Any time, Chris. Any time." As Chris stepped out of the truck, something inside him shifted. The years of pain, of feeling forgotten and discarded, began to crack, letting in the light of recognition and friendship. And for the first time in many years, Chris felt tears well up in his eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being seen. He stood there for a moment, the tears slipping down his scarred cheeks as the truck's taillights disappeared into the night. Chris didn't wipe them away. He let them fall, each one a release of the burdens he had carried for so long. For the first time in years, someone had acknowledged his service, had called him a hero, and that was enough to start healing the wounds that no one else could see. Chris Dober had once been a man of unshakable resolve. As a submariner midshipman, he had served aboard a nuclear submarine, a silent behemoth that prowled the depths of the ocean with its deadly cargo. It was a life of intense discipline, of long hours spent beneath the waves, far from the light of day. But Chris had thrived in that environment, the tight quarters, the constant hum of the machinery, the camaraderie with his fellow sailors. It had all suited him well, until the day everything changed. The fire had started in the engine room, a small spark that quickly grew into a raging inferno. In the confined space of the submarine, with its delicate systems and highly combustible materials, a fire was every sailor's worst nightmare. The threat wasn't just to the crew, but to the world above. One wrong move, and the entire vessel could have been lost, taking with it countless lives and potentially unleashing untold environmental devastation. Chris had been among the first to respond. His training kicked in, and he moved with the precision and calm of someone who had faced danger many times before. But this fire was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The heat was unbearable, the smoke so thick it choked the life out of the air. Despite the overwhelming odds, Chris and his crew fought the flames with everything they had. In the end, they succeeded. The fire was extinguished, and the submarine and everyone aboard was saved. But the victory came at a terrible cost. Chris had suffered severe burns, the flames searing his skin and leaving him permanently scarred. His injuries were so extensive that he was discharged from the service, sent home with a medal for bravery and the hollow words of thanks from his superiors. When Chris returned to his hometown, he hoped for some semblance of normalcy, a chance to recover and rebuild his life. But instead of finding solace, he found only more heartache. His wife, upon seeing the extent of his injuries and the man he had become, couldn't handle it. She packed her suitcase and left him without a word, leaving Chris alone in the house they had once shared. The days that followed were dark. Chris, once so strong and full of purpose, found himself adrift. He turned to alcohol, trying to drown the pain and the memories that haunted him. But even as he drank, he never completely lost control. There was still a part of him that clung to the discipline that had been drilled into him over years of service. He wouldn't let himself fall completely, no matter how tempting it was. Instead, Chris fell into a routine. His days were spent in solitude, the hours stretching endlessly as he tried to find meaning in a life that felt increasingly empty. He still had his small house, the pension from his service, and the memories of his time in the Navy. But those memories were both a comfort and a curse. They reminded him of the man he had been, the things he had accomplished, but they also served as a stark contrast to the man he had become. A few days after the encounter with Chris Dober, the DMV office was running its usual course. Long lines, frustrated customers, and the familiar hum of discontent that seemed to permeate the air. Lucy and Denise were in their usual spots, sipping coffee and half-heartedly attending to the endless stream of paperwork. They had already forgotten about the old man with the burn scars and the incident that had briefly ruffled their day. But the monotony of their routine was about to be shattered. The first sign that something was amiss came when the security guard, who had been dozing off in his chair, suddenly sat up straight, his eyes wide with alarm. Through the glass doors, he could see a group of sharply dressed men and women approaching, led by a man with an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. The guard's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the man at the head of the group, Mitchell Recanzone, the head of the state DMV. Mr. Recanzone was a man who commanded respect. Tall and imposing, with a presence that filled the room, he had a reputation for being a no-nonsense leader who didn't tolerate incompetence or disrespect in any form. His visits were rare, but when they happened, they were never casual. Mitchell Recanzone marched down the narrow corridor of the DMV with purpose, his polished shoes clicking against the tile floor. The guard, suddenly feeling very small, jumped to his feet and opened the door for him, his hands trembling slightly. Lucy and Denise were oblivious to the approaching storm. Denise was flipping through a magazine, and Lucy was chatting idly about a sale she had seen online. Neither of them noticed the hush that fell over the office as Mr. Recanzone approached, nor did they hear the footsteps that stopped just outside their door. When Mr. Recanzone's hand firmly grasped the door handle, he overheard the voice of Lucy muttering something about being busy and how there was no need to roam around without a call. Without hesitation, he flung the door open with a force that made the cheap wood rattle on its hinges. Lucy and Denise froze in place, their eyes wide with shock. Their coffee mugs trembled in their ringed hands, the liquid inside sloshing dangerously close to the rim. For a moment, the room was utterly silent, the air thick with tension. Jennifer, who had been quietly working at her desk, looked up with interest, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "What kind of nonsense is going on here?" Mr. Recanzone's voice boomed through the office, cutting through the silence like a knife. His eyes swept over the room, taking in the disarray, the idle chatter, and the looks of panic on Lucy and Denise's faces. Lucy was the first to recover, though just barely. She tried to smile, batting her eyelashes in a way she thought was charming. "Mr. Recanzoni, sir, we were just—" But Mr. Recanzoni wasn't in the mood to listen. He raised a hand, silencing her immediately. "I'm not here for excuses," he said, his tone icy. "I'm here because the other day, an honourable resident of our city and a war hero, Chris Dober, came to this office seeking help. And instead of receiving the respect and assistance he deserves, he was humiliated." Denise's face paled, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was sinking in fast, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. "Mr. Recanzoni, Denise started, but her voice faltered under his steely gaze. "Enough," he snapped, cutting her off. "I don't want to hear any more excuses. I want to know how it's possible that two experienced clerks in a position of public trust could treat a veteran, someone who has sacrificed so much for this country, with such blatant disrespect." Lucy and Denise exchanged a panicked glance, their minds racing as they tried to come up with a defense, but nothing came. They had been caught red-handed, and there was no talking their way out of this. "Do you have any idea who Chris Dober is?" Mr. Recanzoni continued, his voice rising with indignation. "This man is a hero, a man who saved countless lives at great personal cost, and you had the audacity to treat him like he was nothing, to mock him, to push him out of this office as if he didn't matter." Jennifer watched the scene unfold, a mixture of satisfaction and concern in her heart. She had seen how Lucy and Denise had treated people, but this was the first time they were being held accountable. Still, she knew that the fallout from this would be significant. "Sir," Lucy finally managed to say, her voice trembling, "we didn't mean to—" "I don't care what you meant," Mr. Recanzoni interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "What matters is what you did, and what you did was inexcusable." Lucy and Denise fell silent, their faces ashen. There was no escaping the consequences now. Mr. Recanzoni turned his attention to Jennifer, who met his gaze calmly. "Miss Jennifer," he said, his voice softening slightly, "I understand you were the only one who showed Mr. Dober the respect and assistance he deserved. I want to personally thank you for your professionalism. It's people like you who restore my faith in public service." Jennifer nodded, a small smile of gratitude playing on her lips. "Thank you, Mr. Recanzoni. I just did what I felt was right." Mr. Recanzoni nodded, satisfied with her response. Then he turned back to Lucy and Denise, his expression hardening once more. "As for you two, consider yourselves on notice. There will be a full investigation into your conduct, and I assure you there will be consequences." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out of the office, his entourage following closely behind. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Lucy and Denise in stunned silence, their coffee mugs still trembling in their hands. The office remained quiet for a long moment, the weight of Mr. Recanzoni's words hanging heavily in the air. Finally, one of the customers in line, who had witnessed the entire exchange, spoke up, his voice filled with satisfaction. "About time someone put them in their place." A murmur of agreement spread through the line, the customers exchanging knowing glances. Lucy and Denise, their faces red with humiliation, said nothing. They simply sat there, staring at their desks, too shocked to respond. The changes at the DMV were swift and transformative. After the visit from Mr. Recanzoni, both Lucy and Denise were let go, their dismissal a quiet but firm signal that the old ways of doing things would no longer be tolerated. The news spread quickly through the small town, and people soon noticed that something had shifted in the atmosphere at the DMV. Jennifer, who had always worked diligently and with a quiet sense of duty, was unexpectedly promoted to head of the DMV office. The news took her by surprise, and while the new role came with added responsibilities and concerns, she embraced the challenge with the same dedication she had always shown. With her promotion, Jennifer made it her mission to turn the DMV into a place where people would feel respected and valued. She assembled a young, enthusiastic team, many of whom were eager to learn and bring fresh ideas to the table. Under Jennifer's leadership, the office began to run like a well-oiled machine. Processes were streamlined, and the once-dreaded long lines became a thing of the past. Customers who had previously avoided the DMV now found themselves pleasantly surprised by the efficiency and kindness with which they were treated. Positive feedback poured in, and the reputation of the DMV began to change. The office that had once been a source of frustration was now seen as a model of what public service could be when done right. But the changes in Jennifer's life didn't stop at work. A few weeks after her promotion, a local television station sent a crew to the DMV to film a story about the transformation. The journalists were eager to capture the new energy and efficiency at the office, and they wanted to highlight Jennifer's role in making it happen. It was during this visit that Jennifer met Greg, a camera operator with a warm smile and an easygoing charm. As the crew set up their equipment, Greg found himself drawn to Jennifer's friendly and open demeanor. She moved through the office with confidence, her interactions with both her team and the customers marked by genuine kindness. After the filming wrapped up, Greg struck up a conversation with Jennifer, complimenting her on the work she had done to turn the DMV around. They found themselves talking easily, the conversation flowing from work to more personal topics. Before long, Greg suggested they go for a walk after work to continue their chat. That evening, they strolled through the town's quiet streets, talking about everything from their favorite movies to their childhood dreams. There was a natural connection between them, one that neither of them could deny. When Greg invited Jennifer to the movies the following weekend, she happily accepted. What started as a casual outing soon blossomed into something more. Within a month, Jennifer and Greg were inseparable. They spent their evenings together, exploring new restaurants, attending local events, and simply enjoying each other's company. Greg was captivated by Jennifer's warmth and her unwavering dedication to her work, while Jennifer found in Greg a kindred spirit, someone who understood her and made her feel cherished. At home, even Jennifer's cat seemed to sense the change. The once destructive feline, who had been prone to tearing up the wallpaper out of boredom, became calmer and more content. With Greg around, there was more love and attention to go around, and the cat, much like Jennifer, thrived in the presence of this new joy. Jennifer's life had taken a turn she hadn't expected, but it was a turn she welcomed with open arms. The challenges she faced at work were now matched by the happiness she found in her personal life, and for the first time in a long while, Jennifer felt truly fulfilled. As she and Greg sat together on the couch one evening, the cat curled up between them, Jennifer couldn't help but smile. The road to this moment had been anything but easy, filled with trials and tribulations that had tested her resolve. But looking at Greg, feeling the warmth of his hand in hers, Jennifer knew that every challenge had been worth it. She had found her place both in her work and in her heart, and with that, a new chapter of her life had begun. Memorial Day had always been a day of reflection and remembrance, but this year, it held a special significance for Jennifer. She had been invited as a guest of honor at the town's gathering, a recognition of the positive changes she had brought to the DMV and the community. The event was a grand affair, with the entire town turning out to pay their respects to the veterans and honor the sacrifices made by so many. Jennifer arrived with her friends, including Greg, who was busy setting up his camera for the evening news. The crowd buzzed with excitement, and there was a palpable sense of pride in the air. American flags fluttered in the breeze, and the sound of patriotic music filled the park. As the ceremony began, Jennifer found herself seated near the front, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She had never sought the spotlight, but being recognized for her work and dedication felt incredibly rewarding. Greg, ever the professional, was focused on capturing every moment, though he couldn't resist flashing her a quick, encouraging smile from behind the camera. When it was her turn to speak, Jennifer stepped onto the stage, her nerves soothed by the warm applause that greeted her. She spoke briefly about her commitment to serving the community, emphasizing the importance of kindness and respect in every interaction. The crowd responded with another round of applause, and Jennifer felt a surge of gratitude for the support she had received. As she was about to step down from the stage, something caught her eye. In the crowd, she saw a distinguished man in full dress uniform, his chest adorned with medals that gleamed in the afternoon sun. The sight made her heart race with pride and recognition. Chris Dober, the brave hero she had helped at the DMV, stood tall among the other veterans. Jennifer watched in awe as Chris was invited to the podium to give a speech. His voice, steady and strong, carried over the crowd as he shared his life story with modesty and grace. He spoke of his time in the Navy, the fire that had changed his life, and the challenges he had faced since returning home. But Chris didn't dwell on his struggles. Instead, he spoke of duty, honor, and the importance of humanity. "The most important thing," Chris said, his voice filled with conviction, "is to be human. Not everyone can put themselves in harm's way or sacrifice themselves for others. For me, the true meaning of integrity and kindness was shown by a young woman who helped me when everyone else turned away." Jennifer felt her breath catch as she realized he was talking about her. The crowd was silent, hanging on Chris's every word. When he called her name, inviting her to join him on the podium, the moment felt surreal. With the help of others, Jennifer climbed onto the platform, her heart pounding in her chest. The entire city erupted in applause, the sound echoing across the park like a wave of gratitude and admiration. Chris turned to her, his eyes filled with warmth. "Jennifer," he said, his voice gentle, "you embody the spirit of what it means to serve others with kindness and humility. Thank you for reminding me that there's still goodness in the world." He handed her a beautiful bouquet of roses, their vibrant red blooms a striking contrast to the solemnity of the day. Jennifer accepted the flowers, her hands trembling slightly as the weight of the moment settled over her. The applause continued, and Jennifer couldn't help but smile, her eyes brimming with tears of pride and joy. Greg, capturing every second on camera, felt his heart swell with love for Jennifer. She looked radiant up there, standing beside a hero, being honored for the very qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place. That evening, as they watched the news together, Greg couldn't contain his excitement. "I hope you know how much I love you," Greg said, his eyes shining with affection. "Why's that?" Jennifer asked, a playful smile on her lips. "Just look at yourself on the screen," Greg replied, pointing to the television. "You look like a movie star." Jennifer laughed, the sound light and joyful. "Greg, you're too much. So I'm only a movie star on screen? What about in real life?" Greg pulled her into a tight hug, his voice soft as he looked into her eyes. "In real life, you're even more beautiful." Jennifer's heart melted at his words, and she nestled into his embrace, feeling more cherished than ever. The day had been a whirlwind of emotions, from the honor of being recognized by the town to the overwhelming pride she felt standing beside Chris Dober. But as the evening drew to a close, Jennifer knew that the true beauty of the day wasn't just in the recognition or the applause. It was in the love and support that surrounded her, both from the community and from the man who had captured her heart. As they sat together on the couch, the cat curled up contentedly beside them, Jennifer felt a deep sense of peace. The journey that had brought her to this moment had been filled with challenges, but it had also led her to a place of fulfillment and love, and for that she was endlessly grateful. Thank you for listening to this story. Please share your thoughts in the comments.